incidents, the fact that most of the Duke's army, even before the Prussians arrived, were not actually British has often been forgotten, not least by Wellington himself. But what was of even greater significance for the country was that the defeat of Napoleon not only brought to an end a continental conflict that had lasted for nearly a quarter of a century throughout the adult life of most of the troops taking part, but that it ushered in almost a century before British troops would again be engaged in Europe. Not for another 99 years and 66 days would British soldiers open fire on a Western European enemy. When they did so, on the 23rd of August 1914, it would be 30 miles down the road from Waterloo, at Mons. The Battle of Waterloo was therefore a decisive culmination of a period in British history, but also a hinge point in it. A short, sharp break between the distant worlds of the 18th century and the modern scientific technological age, as contemporaries saw it, of the 19th. A single day's battle, the preliminary skirmishes 2 days before, serious though they were, tended to be overlooked, had changed Britain irrevocably. Above all, Waterloo created a sense of national pride, and a sentiment not entirely unlike the warm glow that infuses modern memories of the Second World War 130 years later. Wellington famously described the battle as a close-run thing, and so it was. It might very well have ended differently, but the victory, however achieved, helped shape the nation's identity and self-esteem across the coming century. What sort of country, though, was Britain in 1815? It was not one filled with martial ardour, not a country in which there was any sense of being all in it together. The long-running war imposed a considerable financial burden on the nation. It had cost the equivalent of 6 times the national income of the 1790s by the time it finished in 1815. The astonishingly precise figure cited was £1,657,854,518. The national debt almost quadrupled from £228 million to £876 million. And the interest on that debt at the end of the war was more than the entire government spending had been at its start. But the cost did not overwhelm the country, and the income tax, which had been introduced to fund the war, was abolished in 1816. Indeed, Britain could afford to fight an entirely separate war on another continent, against the United States at the same time. That cost another £25 million, a war which had ended in one of the British Army's most humiliating defeats only 6 months before Waterloo. The British soldiers who fought on that June day were in many ways separate from the country and the society they were defending. Britain did not use conscription for its soldiers, though it still seized and impressed sailors for its navy. It was not a people's war, as the major conflicts of the 20th century would be. The troops were regulars, mostly drawn from the labouring and unemployed classes, many of them from Ireland and Scotland, the majority of whom had not fought in the previous battles of the Napoleonic Wars, and so were raw in combat. Many of those who survived would not see their homes and families again for years, and, in the days before photography and easy contact, might not be recognized when they did return. There were some who suspected it was a deliberate government policy. In the words of the short-lived radical broadsheet Black Dwarf in 1817, "The army and the people are therefore separated from each other altogether, and no intercourse must be allowed where it can be prevented, lest the soldier should begin to remember that he is a man." Their officers were usually members of the aristocracy and gentry, who had bought their commissions and were scarcely chosen for their military abilities. Quite the reverse. They were united only by the belief that their place was to command. Yet that did not mean that the effects of the wars were not experienced indirectly by the wider population. Although Britain itself had not been invaded, scattered landings in Ireland and Wales in the winter of 1796 to 1797 had been easily repulsed. Many of the country's young men, particularly those living near the Channel coast, had signed up for local militia units. These tended to be derided by cartoonists as full of gormless toy soldiers.